Secretariat was born late March 1970 on a very chilly, kind of foggy evening near midnight, north of Richmond, about 25 miles off of Route 95 in a little town called Doswell, in a stall with a two stall barn in the middle of a field in the middle of the meadow stable, the meadow farm. He was Howard Gentry, who was the farm manager at the meadow, and a friend of his named Raymond Wood knew that the mare was going to foal that night, and they were staying up late playing pool. A fellow named Raymond Wood and Howard Gentry, and they got a phone call from Bob Southworth, the foaling man down at the field, and he said, "You better get down here, that mare's getting ready to foal." So they dropped their cue sticks and they dashed out the door. They went down the road in the car, got off, ran about 100 yards across a field, and got there just in time. She was pacing the stall. She was sweating, her neck was sweating, and she was waxing. Milk was beginning to congeal at the tip of her nipples, which shows that birth was imminent. She suddenly collapsed on a bed of straw and began to give birth, and these two men helped her. They had put their unionalls on, their overalls, and they got down on their hands and knees, and they were helping her with the birth. The foal's shoulders were so big that it looked like he was breeched, and they had to reach in and pull out one leg that was folded under. He pulled out the leg, and they very gently, as she pushed, they pulled, and she pushed, and they pulled. And finally the whole foal came out on the bed of straw, and Mr. Gentry said, "Wow, there's a whopper," which is a line quoted in the movie by Nelson Ellis. And they were, the foal got up very quickly, as it was depicted in the movie, and they rubbed him off and gave him a shot for anti-infection, a cambiotic it's called. And that was his first moments on earth. He began suckling right away from his mother, Something Royal. And he was a very healthy foal. There was nothing sickly about him. He was on his feet very quickly, and they turned him out the next day in the field, and he was at her side until early October. And in fact, 40 years ago, last Wednesday, when they separated them, it's called weaning. The foal was weaned from Something Royal. He was put in a field with a bunch of other boys, where he could romp and kick and bite and play around, and she was put into another field with just broodmares. And the foal, ultimately named Secretariat, yelled and screamed for a couple of days, missing his mother, but that's very normal when you wean a foal away from his mother. He missed her for a few days, but then he was fine after that, and he was eating grass, and he grew up into a very strapping yearling. He was a very good-looking yearling, and he was broken under tack in the fall of his yearling year, which would be 1971. And then in January of 72, having already been broken under saddle, he already had a bit in his mouth, and he'd already had people on his back. He was shipped down to Hialeah in a van down Route 95 from Doswell all the way down to Hialeah, Florida. And he spent a couple of months down there, 3 months down there, beginning to learn how to be a racehorse. Horses might be bred to run, but they're not born knowing how to run. They have to be taught. And he had a man on his back very early. He got beat consistently as a young 2-year-old. There were other quicker 2-year-olds in the same barn, and he frequently would finish third or fourth, beaten a dozen lengths by his companions. And he was just learning. He was kind of awkward. He was big, very sizable. And it took him a while to get his legs under him and to learn how to run and to stretch out and to reach with his forelegs and to scoot his back legs under him. But he began to pick it up naturally. And he eventually began to work fairly quickly. In April of his 2-year-old year, he had been at Hialeah since January. Now it's April. 3 months he'd been in Florida. Now the stable moved up to Belmont Park in New York. And that's where I had just begun to learn how to be a turf rider. I had walked into Belmont Park a month earlier. I had been a political environmental writer, and now suddenly I was I was walking into Belmont Park with a notebook in my hand because I had made a complete change in my life. I had stood up on a table at the Christmas party in 1971, and I recited all the Kentucky Derby winners from 1875 to the then present. And when I dismounted from the table, David Laventhal, the editor of Newsday, said, "Why do you know that?" And I had recited all these Derby winners in succession, and I said, "Well, I've been studying it since I was a kid. I love horse racing. It's my hobby. I love the lore of the racetrack, the Damon Runyon aspect of it, the color, the grooms, the jockeys, the hot walkers, the multimillionaires. They all mix into one society on the racetrack. It's almost a classless society in a kind of a way because everybody just mingles together. And I really kind of like that. I like the color of it. In fact, when I was a kid, I often dreamed of going off to the racetrack, and my mother said, "You might as well join the circus." And so instead of joining the circus, I went to the University of Illinois, where I met Roger. But I've actually considered it. My senior year in high school, I thought of running off to the races, but decided against it and went to the University of Illinois instead. But in any event, I loved racing, and I told that to David. And he said, "Do you gamble?" And I said, "Not really. I'm not interested in gambling much." And he said, "Would you like to be our turf writer? We need somebody to write about horse racing. We don't have anybody to do that. And we're going to a 7-day-a-week paper in April, 72. And we're going to have a big Sunday edition. It's going to be a broadsheet as opposed to the tabloid that Newsday was during the week." And I said, 5 minutes later, I completely did an about-face in my career. And instead of going to the Albany and the White House and other places where I had ambitions of writing about presidents and politicians, I decided instead I was going to write about horses. And so I ended up on the racetrack, and that was April. When he came up, I'd already been on the track for 1 month. And in June of that year, I was around the barn, and an exercise rider said, "I want to show you something." So I went down the barn with him. He gestured into this stall, and there was this beautiful chestnut with 3 white feet, and that white mark that came down, that blaze that started in his forehead and tapered down his nose. And I said, "Good God," I said, "who is that?" He said, "He's an unraced 2-year-old, but," he said, "someday this horse is going to make him forget all the other horses in the barn." And I said, "Well, what?" I said, "He really can run?" And he said, "Yeah." I said, "Gosh, he looks like a show horse." He was so gorgeous looking. He looked like a Greek discus thrower, beautifully muscled. And he had a very inquiring looking eye. He had a very intelligent kind of head, beautiful jowl that you want to see on a male horse, and which gave ample room for his windpipe, and a broad forehead, and looked like he had some brains. And I said, "Boy, I can hardly wait." I said, "Who's he by?" He said, "He's by Bold Ruler out of Something Royal." And those 2 names resonated with me because I'd been studying pedigrees all my life, and I knew exactly who they were. As explained in the movie, Bold Ruler was intense speed. He was the greatest stallion in America and a brilliantly fast racehorse himself. And he passed that quality on to many of his foals. And his mother, Something Royal, she was by Prince Quillo. That was Stamina, as Diane Lane explains in the movie, playing Penny Tweedy. And so I thought, boy, here's a good mix of speed and stamina. Often, though, horses bred like that have the stamina of the speed horse and the speed of the stamina horse. And so it's an unpleasant reversal of virtues, and so you have a plotter. But this horse, 2 weeks later, I saw his entry. I said, "What's his name?" He said, "Secretariat." This was Jimmy Gaffney, and showed me the horse. And I said, "Boy, he looks terrific." And then 2 weeks later, there he was in the entries. I said, "That's the horse Gaffney showed me." Well, he came out of the gate, and he got crushed at the gate, almost knocked off his feet, almost touched his nose on the ground, got up, kind of staggered a little bit at the rear of the pack, and couldn't get any running room, and he ended up finishing 4th, but he was flying at the end. And then 2 weeks after that, he galloped. He was absolutely sensational when he won his first start, his second time. By the way, the movie depicts Lucien Lauren, played by John Malkovich, as getting very angry with the rider and yelling at him, "You really screwed this thing up." And that's exactly what had happened. The rider was on him, Paul Feliciano. He really got reamed out by Lucien Lauren, the trainer. But it really wasn't his fault. But anyway, the horse comes back and he wins big. in his next start, and then he goes to Saratoga, and he is just sensational. He took off like a Roman candle. This horse just flew around the racetrack at Saratoga, won 3 out of 3, including the Hopeful Stakes, where he went from last to first, and in like 190 yards. And it was a brilliant performance, and it was one that would foreshadow or augur for several other starts in his life where he showed absolute brilliance in the middle of a race. Broke it wide open in the middle of it, and that's what he did at the Hopeful at Saratoga. And then that fall, he was so commanding as a 2-year-old, as a baby, that he was voted Horse of the Year in America, which is like, in Oscar language, it's Best Picture. It's the ultimate accolade in the sport, is to be voted the Horse of the Year in America. There's only one. And he was the first 2-year-old to be unanimously voted Horse of the Year as a 2-year-old. He goes to his 3-year-old year. The man who owned him and bred him, Christopher Chenery, who's played by Scott Glenn in the movie, he died, and it suddenly threw the estate into the arms of the federal government, because they were demanding, the death duties in those days were 70%. The estate was worth around $10 million, and so it looked like they were going to have to sell the farm and the weanlings and the yearlings and everything else. But instead, Penny decided to syndicate Secretariat as a breeding stallion, and they got $6 million for him. That was enough to satisfy the federal taxes. So he allowed them to keep all of the weanlings and the yearlings and all the other horses on the farm, as well as the farm, as well as a horse named Riva Ridge, who was another very good horse in that stable. And it allowed them to keep him, and the horse became, he became literally the $6 million man. He was the most expensive racehorse in history. If you do the math, at that time, Secretariat weighed 1,154 pounds. If you convert that into ounces, and you look up and find that gold sold at $90 an ounce in those days, and you do the math, it turns out that Secretariat, as a young 3-year-old, untested, was worth 3 times his weight in gold. And literally the most valuable horse that ever lived, the most valuable animal that ever lived. And he drew a lot of attention to himself simply because of that. People were enraptured with the idea that, here's a horse worth 3 times his weight in gold. And so he ran brilliantly through his early 3-year-old year, heading up to the Kentucky Derby. He won the Bayshore Stakes. He won the Gotham Stakes. And by the way, I have 2 of his Bayshore shoes that he wore during the Bayshore Stakes. I have them framed at home. And they have a back foot and a forefoot, and 2 shoes which still have the mud on them from the day he ran in the mud and he won the Bayshore at Aqueduct. And they're one of my most prized possessions. He won the Gotham after that at a flat mile at Aqueduct. Looked brilliant, looked like he was doing wonderfully going to the Derby. Then he runs in his last start before the Derby, the Wood Memorial, and Sham, his big rival, comes in from California to run against him in the Wood Memorial. And Secretariat had an abscess on his upper lip inside that they didn't know about until the day of the race. And it was infected very badly, and a big boy, it was as big as $50, and it was right under his upper lip, probably a hay briar stuck up in there like a thorn and infected it, and it was very painful. The jockey Turcotte didn't even know about it, and he kept coaxing him to run by, you pull back on a horse, you try to get him to grab the bit to get him to run, and every time he'd pull on him a little bit, that upper lip was pressing against the tooth, and he was tossing his head like this, and he couldn't get the horse to grab the bit. And anyway, he ran very badly, finished 3rd. Sham was 2nd, Angle Light won, and it looked like, it threw open the Derby doors. It threw everything into confusion. Here, the $6 million horse had run like a goat, and